Why do gacha games keep doing this? Seriously, why do so many of them default to a self-insert protagonist even when the story clearly isn't built around one? I've talked before about gacha protagonists and about self-insert characters in general, so this isn't me trying to restart the conversation from scratch. This is something a bit more specific, and honestly it's something that's been confusing me for a while. Because when I look at a lot of modern gacha stories, I'm not even sure self-insert is the right word anymore. Traditionally, self-insert character exists to enable projection. They're usually idealized, competent, respected, easy to imagine yourself in. That's the point, but gacha protagonists don't really work like that. They're often silent, faceless, and kind of absent. Not idealized, just empty. And that's when things start to feel off to me. Because in a lot of these games, the world is strong, the tone is confident, the supporting cast is doing most of the emotional and narrative work. And yet, right at the center of it all, there's a protagonist who barely seems to matter. Take Arknights Endfield for example. This is a game with clear setting, a defined mood and fully voiced characters, and at its core it's a silent, masked protagonist who has very little influence over how the story actually unfolds. What makes that so strange is that the story doesn't seem to need a self-insert at all. It isn't built around player projection, it doesn't really offer agency in return. So the question I want to explore in this video isn't why do gacha games use self-insert protagonists, it's more like this. Why do they keep using them even when they don't seem to serve the story? And what gets lost because of that choice? I want to rewind slightly here, because I think even framing this as blank versus absent doesn't quite get the real issue. Presence alone doesn't mean anything. A character can be present in every scene and still fail completely as a protagonist. And that's the part that keeps tripping me up with a lot of gacha stories, especially ones like Arknights Endfield. Because if we're being honest, the protagonist is present, they're there for most of the story, they witness events, they're technically involved. But none of that is enough. Not for a protagonist, and not for any character that's supposed to anchor a narrative. A protagonist isn't defined by presence, they're defined by what they do, by how they move through the world, by the choices they make, and by how the world reacts to those choices. That's what gives a protagonist shape, and this is where a lot of gacha stories, Endfield included, starts to feel strangely empty to me. Because the usual workaround is obvious. The protagonist is given something special, a unique role, a rare ability, some function that only they can perform, and to be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Protagonists should be special in some way, that's not optional. A point of view character always needs to matter slightly more than everybody else, otherwise there's no reason to follow them. You can argue about edge cases, but at a structural level, that's just how stories work. The problem is when that specialness never translates into meaningful action. When it exists on paper but rarely affects how the story unfolds. When it doesn't force decisions, doesn't create tension, and doesn't leave consequences behind. In Endfield, the protagonist has a role, they have a narrative permission to be important. But I can see a clear vision for why they are the way they are. I can feel a perspective, I can feel an intent. And at this point I'm not even sure disappointment is the right word, it's more confusion. Because the choice to write the protagonist this way feels hollow, not restrained, not deliberate, just inherited. Like the story defaulted to this is a gacha game, so this is how the protagonist works, without asking whatever that actually served the story. You can say it's about player projection, but the protagonist this empty doesn't really invite projection either. There's nothing to project onto, and more importantly, I don't think this kind of story actually needs it. I don't believe players would stop playing if the protagonist were more defined. If anything, I think a lot of them would enjoy the story more. But the gacha format has used this kind of protagonist for so long that many players don't even notice what's missing. They've gotten used to a central character who observes more than they act and exists more than they decide. And that's what makes this feel less like a creative choice and more like a narrative inertia. Not this is what the story needs, but this is how gacha stories are written. This wouldn't bother me nearly as much if those stories didn't already contain better options. And this is the point where I stop thinking about this as a character problem and start thinking about it as a design habit. Because once you strip everything else away, the question isn't really about whatever self-insert protagonist can work. It's about why they keep being used, even when the story clearly isn't built to support them. And the more I look at it, the more it feels like the answer is inertia. Gacha games have developed a very specific set of defaults over time. You have a rotating cast, long-running updates, a need to keep the player centrally positioned without ever fully committing to who that player is, and somewhere along the way, the self-insert protagonist stopped being a deliberate narrative choice and started becoming a checkbox. This is just what gacha games do. You can see it across some of the most successful titles in the genre: Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail, Wuthering Waves. Different worlds, different tones, very different narrative goals, and yet they all default to a protagonist who exists in this strange middle space. Not fully authored, not meaningfully reactive, not truly offering agency either. And the important thing here is that this isn't being done because the story demanded, it's being done because it's safe. A self-insert protagonist avoids committing to a strong perspective, it avoids telling the player who they are, it avoids taking a stance that might alienate someone. From a business and risk management perspective, that makes sense, but narratively it comes at a cost. Because the moment you remove perspective from the protagonist, you also remove authority. The story can't fully speak through them anymore. Conflict gets externalized, moral weight gets pushed onto side characters, big ideas get explained instead of embodied, and the protagonist becomes a kind of narrative buffer, present enough to justify the camera, but detached enough that nothing truly rests on them. What bothers me about this isn't that it's a compromise, is that in a lot of cases, it doesn't feel like anyone stopped to ask whatever the compromise was still necessary, especially when the surrounding story is clearly capable of supporting something stronger. At that point, the self-insert stops being a tool and starts being a limitation, not because it has to be, but because it's being used by default, without a clear sense of what it's actually meant to accomplish. And once that happens, the protagonist doesn't just feel empty, they feel incidental, like they're there because the format expects them to be, not because the story is asking for them. So at this point, I don't really want to talk about what these protagonists are anymore. I want to talk about what they could have been, because that's the part that actually frustrates me. Not that these stories chose a self-insert protagonist, but that they kept brushing it right past much more interesting possibilities that are already baked into their own setups. Take Genshin Impact for example. One of the most common defenses of Genshin's story is that it isn't really about the protagonist, it's about the world. But the story didn't start that way. It started with a very clear, very personal goal: finding a lost sibling. And instead of the goal acting as the spine for the narrative, it slowly fades into the background. The protagonist drifts from region to region, helping solve local problems, waiting for the story to eventually circle back. But imagine if it hadn't. Imagine if the entire journey throughout Teyvat was framed as something the protagonist actively chooses to engage with, not because they're kind, not because they're helpful, but because every alliance, every conflict, every detour is another step towards finding their sibling, and over time that creates friction, because the more involved they become in this world, the more the question changes. Do they stay focused on their original goal, or do they accept responsibility for a world they've grown attached to? That's a moral choice, that's character. And it doesn't require removing the open world structure or the rotating cast, it just requires letting the protagonist want something strongly and letting the story push back against that want. Now compare that to Honkai Star Rail. This is one of the clearest examples of a protagonist who feels like they're being carried by the plot instead of driving it. The trailblazer moves from place to place, watches events unfold, reacts when necessary, but rarely initiates anything. And what makes that especially strange is that the story does give them a potentially compelling hook, lost memories, an unclear origin, a question of what kind of existence they even are. But instead of that being the engine of the narrative, it becomes background flavor. Imagine if Star Rail was actually about that search, not a sightseeing tour of the universe, but a journey driven by the protagonist trying to understand themselves. And imagine if all of those cosmic powers, factions and conflicts weren't just things they happened to run into, but obstacles in the way of that self-discovery. Suddenly the same events take a different weight. The protagonist isn't just present, they're invested, and that investment gives the story direction. Wuthering Waves comes closer than most. There is a central mystery around the protagonist, there is a question of identity and purpose, but that thread keeps getting sidelined. It appears briefly, then disappears for long stretches, replaced by the regional conflicts and external plot lines. But what if it didn't? What if the protagonist actively pursued the truth of who they are? What if they weren't just waiting for answers to surface but deliberately chasing causes, connections, and consequences? What if instead of reacting every time the antagonist made a move, they were trying, and sometimes failing, to stay a step ahead? That doesn't require a louder personality, it doesn't require removing the self-insert entirely, it just requires intent. And this is where things get especially strange to me, because just recently I played through the latest story update in Snowbreak. This is not a massive genre-defying success, it's a much smaller game, and yes, it leans heavily into fan service, sometimes very heavily, and yet sitting there reading through it, I kept thinking the same thing. This is actually well structured. The protagonist has a clear role, the story understands what they're there to do, events unfold because their involvement, not just around them, and the story develops other characters too, just as well. That left me genuinely confused. Why does a smaller game with fewer resources and far less prestige seems more willing to commit to basic narrative structure than some of the biggest gacha titles in the genre, especially when all of these games are working with the same fundamental constraints? And that's what brings me back to the real issue. These protagonists aren't weak because they're self-insert. They're weak because the story refused to let them want something enough to shape the narrative around it. Which is why in the next part I want to narrow this down even further and talk about Arknights Endfield specifically, because Endfield doesn't just inherit this problem, it highlights it. I want to be very clear about something before going any further. I am enjoying Arknights Endfield as a game. Taken as a whole, it's fun, the combat works, the world is interesting, and yes, I have issues with the gacha system themselves, but that's not what this channel is about and it's not what I want to focus on here. What makes Endfield frustrating to me isn't that it's bad, it's that it feels like a missed opportunity. I didn't go into this game with huge expectations. I was skeptical, it's still a gacha game after all, but I was cautiously interested because in the promotional material, the protagonists weren't presented as faceless. They had designs, expressions, they look like actual characters. And then you start the game, and the first thing you see is a mask, and I'm just left asking, why? The characters have faces, they were drawn, they were designed, so why go out of your way to cover them up? Yes, the story gives you a justification, yes, there is a narrative excuse for it, but that's not the point. The point is that it didn't have to be a mask. This is a world with advanced technology. It could have been a procedure, a condition, an implant, literally anything else. Instead, the game chooses the most familiar symbol possible, the faceless gacha protagonist, and then it doubles down. Because it's not just faceless, it's voiceless too. When every major character is fully voiced, when entire scenes are acted out, the protagonist barely speaks. And that's the part that really gets to me, because voice is one of the simplest way to give a character presence, tone, personality, intent. You don't need long monologues, you don't need a loud personality, you just need a sense that this character is participating. And Endfield chooses not to do that, not because it couldn't, but because it didn't want to break free from the gacha template. And that's where my reaction stops being disappointment and turns into something closer to confusion, because I can see a vision behind this choice. I can feel a clear narrative reason. It just feels like this is a gacha game, so this is how the protagonists work. And the moment I realized that, I felt that familiar, hollow feeling. Here we go again. Not because Endfield is bad, but because it does the same thing so many other gacha games have already done, even when it didn't need to. And that's what makes this frustrating, because I genuinely believe that Enfield's story would be stronger if the protagonist were allowed to be more than a placeholder. Not less accessible, not less player friendly, just more intentional. And what worries me is that this doesn't feel like an isolated decision anymore. It feels like a pattern, a genre habit that keeps getting passed along without being questioned. And as much as I enjoy gacha games, that leaves me with this lingering sense that unless something changes, we're going to keep seeing the same protagonist over and over again, slightly redesigned, slightly recontextualized, but functionally identical. And I can't help but feel that we're all missing out because of it. So after all this, what I'm left with isn't anger, it's confusion. Confusion about why this keeps happening, and why the obvious downside of this kind of protagonist doesn't seem to register as a problem. Even if I try to look at this from a more cynical angle, as a product being sold, it still doesn't fully add up. You could argue that the protagonist doesn't matter because they're not what's being monetized, You're selling characters, banners, systems, but these are still narrative-driven games, and narrative engagement does matter. A stronger story keeps people playing longer, it keeps them invested, it gives them a reason to care about the world and the cast. And when the protagonist is written the way they so often are in gacha games, distant, underdefined, barely participating, that engagement drops. The story starts to feel hollow, like something important is missing, and I can't help but think about all of those people who might have stayed with these games longer, who might have become more invested, who might have even spent more money, but didn't, not because the world wasn't interesting, not because the side characters weren't compelling, but because the story never gave them a strong enough reason to emotionally anchor themselves. A protagonist like this doesn't just weaken the narrative, it lowers the ceiling on how much the story can matter, and that's what makes this frustrating. Not that these games fail completely, many of them are still enjoyable, but that they stop themselves from being something more engaging than they already are. As things stand, all I can really do is hope that future gacha games start questioning this default, that they realize the protagonist doesn't have to be this way, that giving the player something more intentional, more active, more defined doesn't make a story less accessible, it makes it stronger. I'd like to believe we'll see that shift eventually, but I'm not gonna hold my breath for that. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. I know this wasn't a hype video and it wasn't meant to be. It was just me trying to work through something that's been bothering me for a while about the genre I actually care about. If you enjoyed this kind of discussion, feel free to like the video or subscribe. And if you disagree with me, that's fine, just keep it thoughtful. I'll see you in the next one.